everyone. Welcome everybody to the first session of the Resilience of the Urban Poor 2021 Forum. My name is Yukiko Ito, Principal Social Development Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, and I will be the moderator for this session. For this main session one, we'll be talking about climate and disaster resilience at the household level. Through the 4 speakers that we have lined up today, we will be looking at adaptive measures that can reduce the risks and strengthen the capacity of the household to tackle the underlying vulnerability of the poor and the vulnerable. So as an overview for this 1-hour session, we will first kick off with a keynote presentation, then followed by the 3 distinguished speakers. And towards the end, we will open for Q&A sessions from the participants. We hope for your active participation in posting questions. And also please note that this session will be recorded. So before we proceed with the presentation, allow me to walk you through a couple of housekeeping about the platform that we are using, since this is the first session that will be navigating through this platform. So everyone, please see on the right side of your screen, you have several tabs. There are tabs on Q&A box, chat box, feedback tabs, and poll question tabs. And so for any questions that you may have along the way throughout this session, please feel free to post any questions in the Q&A box. Or simply, if others had typed in a question and you agree with it, or you kind of like that kind of question, then put a like on it as well, so that you don't have to duplicate the same kind of questions. Also, you can see, you can use the chat box tab. If it's not a question, but you want to share some comments or views or thoughts, something related to this session, please feel free to put those in the chat box, but not the questions, because the questions should be in the Q&A tab. Also, if you see on the left side of your screen, you will see the activity feed, where you can check out for quote cards and insights throughout the forum that is being captured. So that's all for the housekeeping, but why don't we try to warm ourselves up in becoming familiar with this platform? So first, everyone, please click onto your poll question tab on the right side of the screen. And you will be seeing questions appearing. There will be 2, but I will ask the first question first. And you would like to respond to that question by answering yes or no. So let's try the first question. So the first question is poverty a significant driver of risk from disasters and climate change? The answer is yes or no. So let's see how many of you had put yes and a no. The poll is closed, but you can, I think, still add on to it. So let's see. So I'll give you out the answer that the majority of the people had already put there. The answer is yes, as the poor residents are, as you know, disproportionately exposed to disasters and climate risks. So let's move on to the second question. This is a warm-up exercise, and also please everyone try to participate. The second question is, will disasters and climate change likely to affect the urban poor more severely in the future? Yes or no? So please cast in your vote, yes or no. So while we wait a little bit more time, and let us see the results, if it's a yes or a no. Yes. So as many of you said, it's a yes. because as rapid urbanization is happening in Asia and the Pacific, with the increasing climate and disaster risk that is also happening, there will be a likeliness to affect the urban poor more severely in the future if we do not take any actions. So thank you very much, everyone, to participate in this poll question. You're getting familiarized with this platform, so I'm so happy about that. Now, since we're all warmed up and we know how to use the platform, let us proceed with the first keynote speaker that we have. We have Miss Gurley Grace Casimiro Ictiban. Gurley is a Director of Social Development Staff at the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA, in the Philippines. Her short bio can be found, if you want more details about Gurley, to be found in the speaker's profile page. So she will be making 15 minutes presentation on the climate and disaster resilience at the household level in the Philippines. So let us warmly welcome Director Gurley. The floor is yours, Gurley.
Thank you, Yuki, and good day to everyone who's attending online. So for today, I'm going to walk you through this presentation on climate and disaster resilience at the household level. So the Asia Pacific, as we all know, is a region which is very vulnerable to extreme temperatures, flooding by heavy rainfall, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and damage by tropical typhoons. And here in Asia Pacific region, the Philippines is included. So let me show you how susceptible the Philippines is in terms of natural disasters. In 2020 World Bank Risk Index, the Philippines ranks 9 in the world as the most affected country for extreme events. What does this mean? This means that due to its geographic location, the Philippines is susceptible to natural disasters such as typhoons that frequently occur and result in loss of life and damage yearly in the country. And it also results to damage of properties, especially those living in rural areas. But also it also affects those living in urban areas. Risk is particularly high when vulnerable societies are actually hit by extreme natural events. Disaster has also exacerbated the poverty and food insecurity also in the Philippines. And the urban poor in the Philippines are at a particular high risk from the impacts of natural hazards. This is manifested by their high exposure because they are located in the undesirable areas, and vulnerability because of social inequity to natural hazard events amplified by climate change such as flooding, typhoon, rising temperature, drought, storm surges, and sea level rise. The urban poor, especially those residing in informal settlements, are highly vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19 virus or the pandemic that we are currently experiencing. This slide presents the magnitude of the urban poor across the country and in NCR. Actually, there is about 5 million urban poor out of the 9.3 million poor individuals in 2018. There are 3.8 million or 27.2% of the National Capital Region population who live in housing units under 20 square meters with an average number of around 4.7 persons in each household, or only 4.25 square meters per person. The poorest in Metro Manila, which is around 2.1 million or 14.9% of the NCR's population, reside in detached spaces of less than 20 square meters, with an average number of persons in a household of about 4.9. Living space goes down to around 4 square meters per person, and 84,726 senior citizens live with other household members in a living space less than 20 square meters. Based on the findings of the Commission on Population and Development in the Philippines, one of the government agencies in the Philippines which deals with the population, assessing demographic vulnerabilities of communities to COVID-19 inception report that they drafted, the population density of villages in the Philippines In terms of the population density of villages in the Philippines, there are a high number of COVID-19 cases and deaths in high and very high density villages compared to those in low and medium density villages. This only shows us that the higher vulnerability of the urban poor to COVID-19 infection, not just natural hazards, due to the congestion, which makes it difficult to practice safe social distancing measures. In terms of international commitment and national framework and strategies, this slide will show you that the Philippines has the Ambition Natin 2040, or the long-term goal of the Filipino people. And with this, it has four updated, it has four Philippine development plans. The first one is the current updated Philippine Development Plan 2017 to 2022, which will outline the strategies that we need to achieve the Ambition Natin 2040. And also, this Philippine Development Plan is our implementation plan for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes Goal 11, or the Sustainable Communities. And you will find in this PDP the different strategies and indicators that we monitor yearly. The updated Philippine Development Plan 2017 adopts a National Spatial Strategy, or NSS, that recognizes the challenges of urbanization and complexity of development problems such as congestion, inadequate infrastructure, facilities, systems, and social services, as well as vulnerability to natural disasters, all of which we know contribute to the worsening living conditions of the urban poor that are further exacerbated by the health risks brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. The NSS recognizes the urgency to address these challenges by supporting, number one, regional agglomeration through provision of suitable physical and human infrastructure, such as affordable housing, education, and healthcare, increasing connectivity between the laggard and leading regions, and reducing vulnerability to multiple hazards through the investments in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation initiatives. The PDP, or the Philippine Development Plan, has been updated this year to focus its strategies towards a healthy and resilient Philippines while facilitating economic recovery. Also, this updated PDP contains 5 major programs designed to build the resilience of individuals, families, businesses, the government, and society under the new normal, which includes health system improvement, food security, learning continuity, digital transformation, and regional development through the Balik Probinsya Bagong Pag-asa program of the government. Let me walk you through some challenges and recommendations that we currently have in the Philippine Development Plan. As earlier mentioned, 4.9% of the urban population of the country live in slum areas, and many of these informal settlements are located in hazard-prone areas. Also, this amplified during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has severely affected cities, particularly densely populated areas where physical distancing is a challenge. Population growth resulted to uncontrolled urban expansion, affecting access to resources and basic services. Our recommendation is to manage urban development by having an integrated approach to urban planning, by having appropriate development interventions and investment decisions, and regional agglomeration, as I discussed in the NSS, which would an urban and rural migration through the Balik Probinsya Bagong Pag-asa program. Next challenges that we are currently facing, as I mentioned also previously, is the constant exposure to disasters of the country, especially on typhoons. And there is also, they said that there will be a big earthquake in Metro Manila that would be around 7 to 8, the intensity is around 7 to 8. Second is the continuing poverty and food insecurity, which is exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the engagement in low-paying, low-skilled informal jobs, which is due to the lack of education and skills. Our recommendation is actually to institutionalize a comprehensive social protection and livelihood program, especially for the urban poor. We can do this by having risk-informed and shock-responsive social protection system. We need to institutionalize the social protection floor. We need to implement and continuously implement livelihood assistance programs and trainings. And we need a market-driven approach in implementing vocational skills training and placement programs. In terms of challenges of having residences in danger zones and having demolition and eviction activities and the independent implementation of virus-related housing and livelihood assistance programs, our recommendation is to ensure the delivery of adequate housing and having an integrated approach in terms of human settlements and development. We also need to secure tenure, have affordable housing, and provide basic services to our informal sector families. We need to continuously implement livelihood programs which is integrated in the housing assistance provision, such as our resettlement areas. We need to have recovery modalities and approaches towards self-recovery. And then in terms of the challenges, which is exacerbated by the triple burden of health, which is actually a result of rapid urbanization and the urban health inequities that we are currently experiencing, the implementation of an urban health system development, or what we call the USHD program, is aimed at helping cities address the challenges of rapid urbanization brought about by the interplay of different social determinants of health. Second, the use of urban HEART, or the Urban Health Equity Assessment and Response Tools, is intended to help the highly urbanized cities generate systematic data on health inequities to guide effective interventions. On knowledge gaps in climate and disaster resilience in basic education, there should be guidance on the implementation of disaster preparedness measures, protocols on disaster risk reduction, management, coordination, and information management. Continue the implementation of the Department of Education's policies on school-based disaster preparedness and response measures for tropical cyclones, flooding, and other weather-related disturbances and calamities. On the lack of LGU support in the implementation of school-based management in DRRM, the need to recognize the value of school-based management in DRRM and to strengthen support for school-level implementation of disaster risk reduction are needed. We need to also strengthen DepEd's efforts towards building safer schools with the participation of the communities. And that ends my presentation. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you very much, Director Gurley, for the keynote presentation. And the presentation highlighted how to build the resilience of the urban poor by addressing both the climate as well as socioeconomic needs to tackle the multidimensional vulnerability. So thank you very much for that overview presentation. So next, let's move on to the next speaker to learn about Indonesia's case. So the presentation of the speaker would be Pak Maliki. Pak Maliki is the Director for Poverty Alleviation and Community Development at National Development Planning Agency, or Bappenas, in Indonesia. He will be discussing about the role of adaptive social protection in Indonesia and how it can contribute to strengthen the resilience of the urban poor, including shocks and stresses of climate change. So the floor is yours, Pak Maliki.
Thank you, Ibu Yukiko. It's really nice to see you, and it's been a while. We haven't seen each other offline, and I really wish that you are well. And also thank you for ADB inviting me to speak in this event. It's an honor for me, and also for all distinguished participants and distinguished speakers. Just like the Philippines, I guess Indonesia is among the same regions. So we are really located in the very vulnerable locations, especially in Indonesia. I think we are located in the ring of fire, along also with climate change, as the global phenomenon affected our regions too. So Indonesia is very vulnerable to various types of natural disaster. The first slides, please. Yeah, this is shows that every disaster that we have, as what already Ibu Geli also mentioned, is always affected our welfare. So our floods, landslides, cyclones are the most frequent natural disasters in Indonesia over the last 10 years. And it is estimated that at national level, there are like for like the last 20 years, is affected around 17.8 million people affected by disasters. And in terms of cost, it's around 20.8 trillion rupiah. I forget to convert it in billions in US dollars, but I think this is around 228 billions US dollars. And we only can afford to handle that like almost only 20% of those total loss. So it's quite significant effect to us. And here in these slides also shows that every locations, if they have like disaster, always an increase of poverty rates. A number of poor people, especially here is in Sulawesi, is very close to the Philippines. Yeah. So the number of poor people increase in one city around 1,500, and then the other also is almost the same size. So it's almost have influence our poor peoples. And then this one is give our basis to develop on how we can actually develop the policy that really sensitive to this natural disaster and also the climate change. So in terms of laws, next slide, please. In terms of laws, the adaptive social protections framework has been regulated. Not only like two laws that is side by side, is in 2009 and 2007 on social welfare and also disaster management. We also set up in our medium-term development plan in 2020 and 2024. And now our presidents again direct us, because of the influence of the effect of the pandemic COVID is so huge. This pandemic COVID increased around 2 to 3 millions of the new poor people. So then the president asked us in Bappenas to have the social protection reform that actually connected well with the natural disasters and also the climate change programs. Yeah. So it's been 2 or 3 years ago, ADB, the World Bank, also GIZ, the Germany government, as well as the UN family also supported us to build initial concept of our ASP, Adaptive Social Protections. So our ASP concept, next slide please, that is based on 3 principles. One is on social protection itself, and then the second one is on the disaster risk management, and the third one is on climate change adaptations. Based on this integration of these 3 principles, we aim to develop the adaptive social protections by building the roadmaps, yeah, to foresee all the building blocks that we have, including what already our keynote speaker said about the institutional buildings. So we have the institutional arrangement and partnership buildings in the next 2 years. And then we also have to adapt the programs and delivery systems of the social protection, especially that we have to be connected well with the natural disaster management as well as the climate change, adaptive climate change. Yeah? And then also how we can combine and always integrate the financing scheme between these 3 programs. And the last part that is most important that become like a must that we have is data and information. Comprehensive data, either by name, by address, as well as the data on the vulnerability mapping of the locations or the regions along all in Indonesia regions have to be integrated. So then we can have like a planning that is based on their vulnerability on the natural disaster and as well the climate change. And then we also have, in terms of the households level, we also have their conditions and where they are located in the regions. Yeah. So in this case, we have like a 5 phase that we have to build towards the adaptive social protection development. One is the prevent the disaster itself, and then preparedness in the second phase. And then the third one is on residual risk retention and transfers, and then how we can respond. And then in phase 5 is recovery and reconstruction. Yeah, in the disaster prevention, we have to do a few things, that is including prevent the hazardous events through disaster risk analysis. This is have to be like evidence-based. Individual income stabilization programs that is based on the data that we have on the households level, and then also the natural resources management improvement that is actually have to be integrated with the other 2 programs on natural disaster and also the climate change. On the preparedness, we have also to set grounds for all the stakeholders. So we can have like a good communication, socialization, also education system, that the whole system, the whole government level knows in the same way about the ASP, and also the awareness of the natural disaster and also the climate change risk to the welfare of the households level at their regions. Yeah. So this one is actually have to be coordinated, not only the government, but also the non-government. The government itself, we also have to be like the central as well as the local government, from the provincial level to the village level. In the phase 3, on the residual risk retention, we have to providing emergency response and finance resilience recovery activities for disaster affected communities. So I think the previous keynotes already mentions about the livelihood. Yeah. So this one is like also one of our strategy in the nearest futures. And the phase 4 is like we have to have effective and efficient response activities based on preparedness phase, yeah, and also include the development of the response capacities for all actors. So I think if everybody knows with the same level of knowledge, then we also improve the capacity on responding the natural disaster and also the climate change, then I think we are going to have the same in the same frequency. So the last part is on how we can have appropriate and time-bound recovery supports for people and also the government using the Build Back Better. Next slide, please. So today we are talking about the resilience at the households level. Therefore, I think the prerequisites for this program is actually the data on the households itself. So we have to have mapping on the vulnerable affected communities. So this one is like the potential, because we already mapping the households level with their welfare levels, with their vulnerability level at the regions. This one is like a cooperation between our data on house levels, especially on the Ministry of Social Affairs, with our natural response institutions at the Ministry of Foreign on Home Affairs. Yeah. So the overlapping and mapping the data will produce mapping of vulnerability affected communities that will give like a good mapping of the conditions of the households. Therefore, there is we have to design the programs that based on the coordination between the whole sectors, not only the social sectors, but also the health, educations, and other existing programs is actually are going to be optimized, but then it's just based on this mapping. So this one is also coordinated with the local government then we are going to have from all of this mapping, and then we have the mapping of the programs itself. We are going to have the adaptive social protection using the regular social protection program. So basically, actually, we are going to empower the regular social protection program to make it more efficient. But because we have this evidence base and also the vulnerability of the mapping of the regions, I think our planning system and then also the implementation system will be based on that one. So this are also going to have, become like our disaster management with the output that we expect is the preparedness of the community level, and also the comprehensive social protection for disaster victims, fast recovery after disaster, and also the availability of sustainable financing. So way forward that we are going to have, all of this concept is going to be finalized this year. And then we are going to have also the pilot projects that just to ensure this roadmap and also the system works well at the regions and also the community level. Then we are going to have one regulatory framework to regulate these adaptive social protections. So next slide, please. Is we need to have like resource mobilizations. Yeah. So we are going to enhance our human and technical capacities for financial data management, risk vulnerability assessment, poverty targeting, cost-benefit analysis, fund management, also develop new schemes and tools for budgetary and non-budgetary financing based on the risk layering approach. And then a few things that we are going to do the next year is organizational development. This one is institutional and also delivery mechanisms, because this one is involve a few major line ministers as also the local government. Therefore, we have to have like good coordination mechanisms. Therefore, we have to strengthen ASP policy making bodies. In this case, one example is Ministry of Social Affairs, and then also the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Home Affairs, including the Ministry of Environment. Yeah. And then we also have to improve the external stakeholders relations for monitoring and evaluation of the impact of the ASP. And then last one is how to enable the environment. This one is to adopt policies and strategies as well as institutional legal regulatory framework to the needs of the DRFI as a constituent component of the ASP system. So I guess that's all my presentation. Thank you, Bu Yukiko.
Thank you very much, Director Mariki, for explaining the importance and the framework of adaptive social protection that can build the household capacity to adapt, anticipate. Is it off? Oh, sorry. So thank you very much, Director Mariki, for explaining the importance and the framework of adaptive social protection that can build household capacity to adapt, anticipate, and to absorb the current and future shocks and stresses while managing the residual risks with the whole of the government approach. So thank you very much for comprehensively explaining what you are doing in Indonesia right now. So next, let's hear from Ms. Suranjana Gupta, who is the advisor on community resilience at Huayru Commission, to tell us how the community-based organizations or the women's group has its role to strengthen climate disaster resilience. So Suranjana, would you be able to tell us about some good practices that you have seen happening through your partner organizations to strengthen the household resilience through different adaptive measures, I guess, such as in the area of social protection, livelihood, health, and housing interventions?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Yuki. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just start by introducing Huayru Commission. For those of you who are not aware, the Huayru Commission is a global coalition that works on grassroots women's leadership and empowerment in advancing and building community resilience And so while the challenges of resilience and the changes that occur in resilience occur and are manifested at the household level, we believe that the foundations of these occur at a community and collective level. So we work with organized groups of women or women-led groups who are in low-income and poor urban, rural, and indigenous communities. So the basis of our work is really in supporting these small groups to negotiate for improved access and control over resources, and as well as greater access to public decision-making processes and networks. Because ultimately, people depend on assets and networks in order to build resilience or secure themselves in crises. So let me start with the idea that it's women's groups that we see who are essentially making social protection programs more shock responsive. And we could see this very clearly in the COVID crisis, because we saw that they are often the kind of hyper-local data that grassroots women's groups have is not available with government. So they're able to update or enhance the targeting of beneficiaries of social protection programs. They often improve access by supporting the most marginalized and vulnerable households to actually complete the procedures and access the programs. And then they play a caregiving role to take care of families and communities by providing food or shelter to families and households until the program actually kicks in. So we've seen these different roles being played in groups in India in relation to the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. We've seen that groups have played a vital role in monitoring the delivery of social protection in the Philippines, for example, after Typhoon Haiyan. But I think the issue there is that in each crisis, this has to be renegotiated with government. So the question is, why isn't it getting institutionalized as something that, and why aren't we investing enough in it upfront to make sure that grassroots women have this institutionalized role, which is recognized and supported by governments upfront? The second area, I think, where we see grassroots organizations playing a big role is by supporting communities to build livelihoods options. So by both diversifying livelihoods as well as testing and demonstrating and innovating around building more resilient livelihoods. So for example, we have a large number of groups today who are doing the 1 acre model of farming, where women's groups in India are doing organic farming in small plots of land. Or we have urban kitchen gardens and urban agriculture, which has picked up in a big way. And while many of these initiatives were begun as part of building resilience to climate change and building food security, we saw that these were actually very effectively used and became major sources of food during the COVID crisis. But the insight or lesson from this work is really that grassroots organizations need flexible resources in their hands in order to ensure that they can experiment and test solutions and then leverage these solutions to access other government resources and build relationships and collaboration with government. And also the fact that you first need to have greater control over resources to quickly pivot the use of resources in response to changing circumstances. So the only other example I would add, which I think deserves much more in-depth analysis, is that of relocation in housing. So for example, our member group in the Philippines has done a lot of long-term work in supporting, they were among the organizations who supported 7 or 8 to 10,000 families to relocate in a flood control program where families had to move out of the Pasig River canals. Now, again, there the trade-offs are so complicated when families have to relocate. And the risks are there's a variety of different risks and threats, and groups have to make sure that we're not just sort of swapping climate or disaster threats for some other kind of threats, like livelihoods related risks and threats. So there, I think, again, being organized and being part of a designed program where communities have very high ownership of the choices they make makes a big difference to creating relocation processes that are relatively conflict-free. So the underlying basis of the examples that I'm sharing with you is really that there needs to be much more investment and acknowledgement that grassroots organizations and groups need to have an organized basis, and this collective leadership is very critical to the ability to enhance access and control over resources and to have a greater voice for marginalized groups in public decision making. So I think I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Suranjana, for giving the examples, what is actually happening in the ground on the importance of these kind of grassroots community-led adaptation measures that can impact and also to address the localized disaster and climate risk at the poor household where your partner grassroots organizations are working. Just a quick additional insight, if you may share us, that how has all of these grassroots, examples had been able to scale up to as a good practice in a national level or a wide range of scales. Would you be able to share that kind of your insights, please?
Sure. So there, at the local level, we see a lot of scaling up occurring through grassroots-led practice transfers, where groups are going to train and teach and mentor and support their peer groups in order to sort of increase the number of households and the number of communities who are practicing and can adopt similar practices. And that's a very effective method because it allows, again, for local variation in the practices. But at the government level, I think we see it in some different ways. One is that there's recognition of what women's role in advancing resilience actually means. So, for example, in India, where grassroots women were not at all recognized as farmers in their own right because they do not own land, we are seeing increasingly that government institutions are recognizing women as farmers and therefore giving them the inputs and the technology required to actually undertake agriculture more effectively in the context of climate change. So, for example, they're being trained to do soil testing. So there's also this acknowledgement also results in the ability of women's groups to actually gain access to resources or be appointed in formal roles. So we've seen, for example, in the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan, where groups were actually formally given the role of monitoring the relief aid and delivery, but also monitoring the conditionalities around household social protection programs. So there we are seeing, so a lot of it has to do with what is the formal recognition that groups are getting. And often we're also seeing that members of groups are appointed by government for training purposes. So we're seeing the scaling up take different forms that are around institutional recognition, but we still, I think, have a long way to go in terms of these and for further institutionalizing and consolidating these kinds of approaches in terms of having the right kinds of policy incentives and financial incentives in place that actually take these to the next scale in terms of scaling up. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much for all of those insights. Next, actually, it's the last but not the least, Mr. Anshukant Taneja, who is the Principal Investment Specialist at the Private Sector Operation at Asian Development Bank, who will be discussing about the housing investment projects and how these are benefiting the urban poor to strengthen their resilience while improving the and to see their decent and affordable homes with access to clean water and sanitation too. So over to you, Anshukant.
Yeah, sorry about that. Am I audible now, please? Yeah, thanks, Ed. And thank you, Yuki, for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'll probably be talking about a small part of the entire sort of spectrum of issues around, urban settlements and the issue of building climate change and disaster resilience. I think there were sort of references to this issue by all the speakers before me, which was about talking about resources as to where to mobilize resources to sort of handle this situation, which is getting worse by the hour, literally. I wouldn't really spend time in estimating, the amount of investment that is required, because I think beyond a point, it's a bit of a futile exercise, because it's really a very staggering figure. I think for each country that we are talking of, it runs into several $100 billion, like some of the estimates were shared also about Indonesia and Philippines in the past discussion. So I think the issue is that where can we sort of look around to tap resources which will help address this problem? We are seeing a greater private sector involvement in the issue of housing for the poor, especially for the urban poor. Housing which was typically seen to be a very mortgage financing model, which was rolled out in Asia, which was a kind of a derivative of what we saw in the Western markets, or the developed countries, as they're called. That was a highly collateralized lending model in which, the value of the collateral and the income source for the borrowers are the main considerations. And that was how it sort of spread in many of our member countries. But that is sort of addressing a profile of borrowers or the profile of income level, which is not really relevant or contextual to the issue that we are discussing, which is about the urban and the rural poor. We are seeing increasingly adaptation of that model in terms of housing for the low-income categories, which is now called affordable housing in markets like India. It's called low-income housing in markets like Philippines and Indonesia. And that is getting more institutionalized. Of course, there's an issue of accelerating that work, but at least it is finding its feet. And that business model is now getting access to commercial financing. It's adopting more market-based solutions. And we are hopeful that, with that intervention, it can be scaled up. But that affordable housing is still addressing a very small part of the entire market or the demand for housing by the urban poor. The demand for housing here we see usually in the context of the housing stock, which means probably the amount of investment needed to build new houses. But what we are also trying to focus in ADB is that a fair amount of sort of resilience building can also happen through home improvement financing, which means financing essentially for refurbishing or re-roofing of the existing dwellings where the household is sort of already living. So this does not sort of entail, acquisition of land or relocation. It's probably a more incremental approach and probably also a bit of a patchwork approach, as some critics call. But it is delivering tangible results because clearly the quality of the dwelling after the financing and the capacity building intervention is of a much superior quality. There is a concretized roof, there's adoption of better ventilation, sometimes adoption also of solar home lighting and electricity, and access to on-site sanitation. So that's how we are sort of trying to build up on this model of home improvement financing and using the microfinance institutions as the vehicle for delivering this kind of a loan product. It still faces a lot of operational challenges. It's not been scaled up pretty substantially. And we are trying to address that problem in ADB through our project. This graph, which is a bit dated, but still talks about what's been happening to access to micro housing finance to institutions in India, institutions in Asia. But this data that we have is still about 2019, but we tried to extrapolate. So we are seeing in Asia Pacific, if you see the bold curve, it's dipping very substantially after 2015-17. So the percentage of institutions which were offering micro housing finance for the poor has come down quite substantially. And we believe that post 2020, because of the impact of the pandemic, that number would have come down even further. And less than 5% of the institutions right now are able to commercialize this kind of a loan product and also deliver it to the urban poor borrowers. This is the problem on the supply side, and the problem on the demand side, I think, which many of us refer to, has also become much worse. The impact of the pandemic on the poor in Asia and the Pacific has been really, very severe. I won't go into the numbers over here, but if you look at the bold trend line, that was how poverty was reducing in Asia with the intervention of the various governments and the institutions and the private sector. But because of the pandemic, now we have different scenarios of a pretty sharp increase in number of people who are living below the poverty line, estimated at $3.2 a day. And we're anticipating that about close to 450 to 500 million have been added back to the poverty bucket, which is literally sort of wiping out the progress which was made in the past 6 to 8 years. So that's the fallout on the demand side, that the poor, which were always more vulnerable, are now a little bit more poor and therefore more vulnerable to the changes coming from climate change and disasters. The issue why we are not sort of typically able to scale up this home improvement financing, I think ADB ran a diagnostic of that for some of the markets that we are working in across 12 MFIs in 4 countries. The main findings that we had was that, one, the loan product itself is not very well aligned to the needs of the borrowers. And secondly, the delivery channel, which is the way in which the loan product is going to be given to the borrowers and where the home improvement financing is going to be structured as a project, that delivery channel needs to be substantially scaled up, and some capacity building work is also required there. So in a sort of stepping back, ADB sees this as both a capacity building problem as a financing problem also. So just following one of the two activities probably will not deliver the results. Getting into some specifics over here, the typical home improvement loans that we have seen so far prevalent in Asia are in the range of $500 to $700 for borrower. These are substantially lower than what the actual requirements are, which are typically in the range of about $1,800 to $2,000. So essentially, there's an element of underfinancing over here, which is part of the problem. Secondly, these loans are not really well structured. They are still provided as a typical income generating loan, which the MFIs or microfinance institutions tend to give to the borrowers. So the repayment profile is too tight or too narrow for the borrowers to repay the dues in a kind of a timely and a balanced way. And in terms of delivery channel, there is no hand-holding being facilitated in this entire activity. So the institutions which were involved in delivering such loan products were not sort of building up substantial capacities in their ground level or the branch level to sort of ensure that these are delivered in the right manner. And that these two factors were sort of holding back what could potentially be a low-hanging fruit in terms of getting outputs for building disaster resilience and climate change resilience. What ADB is doing, and quickly sort of running through that, is that we are sort of taking a two-prong approach. So we provide a kind of a risk transfer arrangement in which lenders for these kind of loans are able to share their risk with ADB. I think, fortunately, ADB is rated AAA by the external agency. So that allows commercial lenders from private sector to share the risk for these kind of loans. And that is sort of facilitating more private sector capital coming into the sector. Secondly, with this extended maturity and better access to finance for the intermediaries, we are also working with a technical partner to help MFIs build up their capacity to deliver these loan products. Our technical partner here for this regional project is Habitat for Humanity. That's a pretty well-established NGO which works in the housing sector. And they have a fair amount of experience. So we are taking a kind of a institutionalized hand-holding approach for the MFIs. It's an engagement which lasts typically 2 years or a bit beyond that, in which this capacity building work is sort of being taken up. This is helping build, resilience at the household level in the peri-urban areas, which is where we are focusing right now. Because the urban areas, I think the income levels of several of the dwellers are still sort of at a higher level. We're also trying to see this from a climate change adaptation kind of lens. So a lot of the building design and material and use of alternate energy sources is being encouraged. For instance, we are recently started some work on trying to pilot test usage of roof painting materials, which will enhance the heat resilience of some of these households, because we are expecting that many of these urban areas will face pretty high temperatures in the years to come. This is also giving extremely good results on the gender mainstreaming part, because in most of the cases, the borrowers for these kind of home improvement loans are women. And that results in a kind of a transfer of resources in their hands. And also they're very actively involved in the decision making, which is being actively sort of encouraged by ADB. And we also see this as a scalable solution. So the intent is that other institutions and commercial lenders will come in based on the kind of a template or model that ADB is trying to develop here. Quickly sort of giving some context of what exactly is proposed under this partnership with Habitat for Humanity. Sorry about my throat. Yeah, so we are on an annual basis, we deliver about $400 million of financing, and we are targeting that about 15% of that going forward is going for home microloans. It seems like a low number, but currently the levels are less than 1%. So we are still sort of scaling it up quite substantially. We're not trying to monopolize the solution to this problem. So every year we're expecting that about 35 to 40,000 households in urban areas are going to benefit from these kind of financing arrangements. We partner with about close to 30 MFIs in Asia. So right now, the project is being rolled out in Philippines, Indonesia, and India. And in the second phase, we are targeting countries like Nepal, Pakistan, and a few in Central Asia. And we're also seeing this now from a disaster resilience context. So the choice of areas that we are looking for this intervention are going to be the ones which are more vulnerable to flooding or to limited access to drinking water, where I think the challenges might be increasing in future. And the capacity building work is being funded by UCCRTF, I should mention that, which is one of the sponsors also for this event. That's it from my side, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for explaining about the ongoing microloans to ensure the affordability of the housing, while improving the construction of the quality and the climate resilience feature of their homes. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we have a few more minutes left, and I just want to look at the some of the questions. You also can see in your, the Q&A box, some of them has been answered. But I'd like to just pick on one, which is what criteria is used to define urban poor. And there's a response within the chat box that it's defined based on the country's context, and definition followed in the census. But I'd like to kind of turn this over to Director Gurley to give a perspective of how the Philippines define the urban poor. Quickly, please.
Thank you, Yuki. For the Philippines, we define urban poor as any individual residing in an urban area who belongs to a poor family or whose income falls below the poverty threshold set by the national government.
Okay, thank you very much. That's for the Philippines, and I'm sure that the countries have different definition, but more or less based on that. So maybe just to give just one last question, perhaps. The presentations will be provided within this platform soon. And there are some questions about innovative approach used to raise awareness on the climate change and disaster risk for the urban community. Perhaps, Suranjana, a quick question, answer from you, please.
Thanks, Yuki. So I would outline two small things. One is that we have what we call a community resilience fund, which is around channeling money to grassroots organizations, which allows them to address not only their practice, which looks at anything ranging from urban kitchen gardens to upgrading small infrastructure or training groups, but it also includes it's not just the technical piece, it also includes the what we might call the political piece or the empowerment piece, which has to do with building leadership and supporting groups to actually negotiate and engage and partner with local governments or other government institutions. If I can have one more minute, I'll give you another example of the risk mapping processes that grassroots organizations use. And I'm referring now particularly to my colleagues in the Philippines who have used the risk mapping process very effectively, not just to identify areas that are vulnerable to disasters, but also to bring in local governments from the barangays to participate in this risk mapping as a means of bringing in and sourcing more information on the barangay and resources available, as well as part of starting a conversation with barangay officials on what communities are doing, what their priorities are, and starting to build a relationship between the communities and the local government. So those are two that I'd put in.
Thank you, Suranjana. I'm afraid we've exhausted the time. There are a couple of more questions in the Q&A session. We'll try to respond to them after the sessions. But last, thank you very much for the 4 speakers for sharing the experience on how to strengthen the resilience at the household level for the urban poor. And just the last 2 points on the housekeeping matters. There's going to be a quick evaluation that would appear at the end of this session on the feedback tab. So please kindly fill those in before you leave for your break. And for those who are requesting for a certificate of attendance, you may claim throughout the duration of the forum by clicking onto the tab on the left side of the screen. So with that, thank you very much, all the panelists and all of the participants for joining this very first session. And you will have a 15 minutes break until the next session. Thank you very much and keep safe and bye-bye.